Hello and welcome to another edition of Bible Study Online. Brenton here, some might call it Hipster Brenton. I just got these new blue light glasses and they're working out pretty good for me. We are in the book of Esther. We're in chapter 3 and today we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 15. Without further ado, why don't we take a look? So just testing out my pen again to make sure it works. All right. Hey, that works out pretty good. Okay, another recap of our method, our SOAP method. First step is always to pray, spend a little bit of time in prayer. Second is to read the passage. So before you start your own study, read Esther chapter 3, 1 through 15. I'd suggest doing it maybe 2 or 3 times. Then you obviously move into observation, interpretation. Remember, observation is just noticing things in the text. Interpretation is then asking the question, okay, what does this mean? Finally, application, and my 2 big questions. 1, how does this apply to the gospel? And 2, how does this apply to me? And finally, spend some time in prayer, praying back to God the things that you've learned in the text. So today we've got 15 passages to get through. I'm going to focus on a couple of them that I think are really important to this text. But again, remember the focus of this study is not that you just watch this video, it's that you get some time away to really dig deep into this text for yourself. Okay, here we are, Esther chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. After these things, King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite, son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. This means that Haman was really kind of a prime minister. He was second in charge of the whole kingdom to the king. The other thing that you may have picked up on is that this is the first time that we see Haman in this passage. Now, if you watched the first video, you would know that Haman is the villain in the story of Esther, and we'll find out why. Verse 2, and all the king's servants were at the king's gate, bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. This is a really important point again, because Mordecai gets himself in lots of trouble in this text, but I would say good trouble. Verse 3, then the king's servant who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them he was a Jew. Now, if you remember, Mordecai expressly told Esther not to communicate that she was Jewish. But here we see Mordecai is telling the people that he is Jewish. Unsure of why he's doing that, but if I were to take a guess, it looks as though as he's trying to protect Esther here by taking the blunt of Jewish hatred in the city. Verse 5, and when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Haman is a bit of a wimp, and fun fact, the word Haman in Hebrew kind of sounds like confusion, which is a big theme for Haman. He not only causes confusion, but in the end, he ends up being confused about who's really in charge of this kingdom. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. I don't know about you, but I often wonder as to why Jewish people throughout history are being so persecuted. You think just even recently in the 1940s and World War II, where Nazi Germany tried to eradicate the Jewish people again. So this is not a new idea, and it's also not a new idea in their day. I don't think the Bible gives us any clues as to why the Jews were hated so much, but it's easy to see that God's people, no matter where they are, face severe persecution. Let's keep going in verse 7. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, they cast pur. That is, they cast lots. If you've been reading some of the Old Testament, you'll see this casting of lots fairly commonly. Casting lots could have been throwing a couple of stones on the floor or some sticks. It's unsure what it actually looked like, but it would almost like us being rolling dice and saying yes if you got below a 3 or saying no if you got above a 3. It really was a way for them to try and make decisions, and particularly for the Hebrews, this is how they tried to seek the will of God. So they cast pur, that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed amongst the peoples in the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them." Now, Haman is causing a lot of confusion in what he's saying to the king. First of all, let's notice who Haman is pointing out to the king. He says, there is a certain people. Now, he's meaning here the Jews, but what's interesting here is that he doesn't mention this is because of Mordecai. Mordecai, if you remember, in the last chapter, actually helped save the king's life. So if he had have mentioned Mordecai to the king, he probably wouldn't have got his approval. Notice next, Haman is trying to tell the king that these people's laws are different of every other people, and that they do not keep the king's laws. It's true that the Jewish people had their own set of laws, but Haman's lying here when he says that they did not keep the king's laws. Jewish people were commanded to live in harmony with the people that they were exiled to, and this would have been true during Haman's day. Let's read on in verse 9. "If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." So the king took the signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." Now, when the king gives Haman his signet ring, he's giving him the authority of the king. So Haman would have drafted up a law, he would have taken the king's ring, dipped it in some wax, and put it on that law to signify that the king has approved this new edict, which is that every Jewish person in his kingdom is to be destroyed. It's a pretty massive law that he's writing here. The king has no idea who these people are that he is calling to be destroyed. All he knows is that it's a certain group of people that aren't following his laws. So in his mind, he just thinks, well, let's just get them out the way. It might be 10 people, it could be 100 people, but the Jewish people would have been a very sizable number. So the king is really being tricked here by Haman to further Haman's purposes. So moving on to verse 12, this really just kind of describes how that law is going to get passed out. But if we go down to verse 13, we're going to see some pretty gruesome stuff. It says, "Letters were sent by the couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day." One day. That's mind-boggling. The 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. You can see that this is a complete and total annihilation, or at least the attempted annihilation of the Jewish people. Verse 14 and 15 is another summary of how this edict is going to be brought about. But the last sentence is interesting, where it says, "And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion." There's that word again, confusion, which again sounds like the word Haman in Hebrew. What's interesting here is that the people of Susa were confused by this edict. They didn't know why it was so important for all the Jewish people to be killed, whereas Haman and all of his buddies would have thought this was a good idea. So here we have it. Now the stage is set for an epic battle between Mordecai, Queen Esther, against Haman. And we're going to see this played out through the rest of the book, and I bet you could take a guess at who's going to win this battle. Let's move into a time of looking at some applications to this text, and we're going to kick it off by hearing from none other than Hattie Brown.
Okay, sick. So we are obviously in chapter 3 of Esther. This is a really intense chapter. I was getting to about verse 10, 12, and I was like, yo, God, can you please just show up now so I can answer these questions? But that's why we're here, to walk through this together, to talk about this together and understand it together. So Esther is a really important book. It's a really important part of the Bible. What you need to know about it is you really need to read it from start to finish in one setting before you start it. And Brenton did say that a couple weeks ago, which helped me understand this passage. You just read through it before with Brenton, and you're probably trying to understand, how does this lead you back to the gospel, and how can I apply this to myself? So the first question is, how does this passage point you to the gospel? This is a passage that is full of unjust crimes. It is a passage that you sit there and go, well, where is God? Where is the justice for these people? These people need God. They're crying, this is King Xerxes is doing something that is wrong. I don't understand. But I think where this leads back to the gospel is that God, and spoiler alert, God does show up in Esther, that God does show up. He always shows up, and time again in the Old Testament, that these awful things happen, and that no matter what, no matter how hard it gets, that God shows up. God doesn't look at this and go, you know what, it's too much, I tap out, or this is too much for me. He's never thought that. He's bigger than that. No suffering is too big for him, and no unjust moment is too much for him to handle that. Even when his people are threatened to be persecuted, that he does show up in that. How does this passage apply to us? So to me, to you as Christians. So I've never been through anything like this. My life has never been threatened because I'm a Christian. I, however, have been persecuted in the way that I've lost friendships. Maybe you've lost family members. What we believe is not culturally popular. In our hearts, we know that the Bible and what God teaches us is how we should live. We don't know how it feels to have our life threatened, but we do know that feeling of not being the same as everyone else, and feeling like you don't belong, and that people are constantly against you, and it sometimes feels like the whole world is against you in that, and the whole world doesn't want you to believe in God, but in your heart, God is screaming louder than ever that what you're doing is right, that he has you. This part of Esther, that this book isn't in the Bible for no reason, that God put this in the Bible for a reason, because there we have a moment where God's people are going to be murdered for no reason. And as we will find out in weeks to come, that God, like every other time in this book and in our lives, he shows up and he has us in his hand and he catches us every single time.
Thanks so much for that, Hattie. It's so good to know that God has us. A couple of extra applications that I had when I was looking at the text. How does this apply to the gospel for me? Well, when I look at this passage, I'm excited that God's promised plans to annihilate evil is greater than man's thwarted plans to persecute people. In this passage, we are pointed to the coming Savior, Jesus, where one day he will wipe away every tear from our eyes, where sin will be no more, evil will have no more say in this world. And what an amazing day that will be. My second application question that I always like to ask is, what does this passage mean to me? Well, not only knowing the end of the story of Esther, but also the end of the biblical story, it reminds me to trust that God is just. Trust that God is just. He is a good God that detests evil, that is holy and set apart. He cannot be near sin. And what a gift it is that we know that He will give justice to the oppressed, justice to the downtrodden, justice to those who have been wronged. We need to trust that God is just. I trust that this passage would give you that hope this week, and I pray that you would get some amazing insights and get to hear from the Holy Spirit as you opened up this text for yourself. Looking forward to seeing you next week.